Thank you, Rush, and thanks for this invitation. I'm kind of humbled to be like amongst all those professionals with, and to talk to you a little bit about open data standards. I actually also have cassettes in my basement. I also have vinyl, so I'm hoping that doesn't disqualify me from talking to you about technology. So here we're, the Open Contracting Partnership, the organization that I work with, is a independent organization that works with business, private sector, public sector, and civil society to jointly work together and collaborate on opening up public procurement, making this information more transparent, and use this information that comes out of it to transform government contracting. So what is open contracting? It's a term that we are sort of using to say that, here we're talking about that's the data that you're all generating through procurement. We disclose this publicly, and if we do this through a standardized open data format that I'll be presenting to you, we can use this information to engage different stakeholders, citizens, private sector suppliers, but also from government in of itself. And this will lead to a couple of benefits that we're seeing from working with other countries. So we have here the opportunity to use this data to analyze it better and to create engagement and feedback loops that then help us to solve problems better. So this standard that I'll be talking about and the idea of open contracting is built about very clear focus on user needs. So we'll look at value for money and more efficiency from within government. So the information that we need to deliver those. Clearly, like increasing competition, providing better environment information to our suppliers, a clear focus on transparency and anti-corruption as some of the information that is required or requested by citizens. And then looking at like how do we actually create better public services? How do we get school lunches that are high quality but also affordable? So the open contracting idea is built around these user cases and starting from a need. How do we work with government or businesses? We look at and think first about the need, and I'll be talking about that in when we talk about how to implement open standards. So this is actually a picture from Georgia. It looks very messy. I think we've been talking about how we're overcoming this process through technology, and I think there has been incredible progress made. But often the information still looks a little bit like my house when my son takes out the Lego blocks. And then we go around and we start sorting this information. I think that's maybe like a stage on where we are now. We start arranging them, making sense of those blocks. And in an ideal world, we end up with presenting it visually and being able to actually use this data for our values. So this is in a way what the Open Contracting Data Standard does. It takes and it pulls out information from all the different systems, and it suggests here's the information that you want to publish if you want to sort of work around these use cases. If you want to deliver value for money, this is the data that is useful, that has been useful for other countries, for other cities around the world. So it's built on best practices. And it's been developed about 2.5 years ago in collaboration and based out of the World Bank, but in collaboration with like a global community of practitioners, of procurement practitioners. So it's about, you can imagine it in a way, if you think about it, less analog, like an Excel sheet that has like a 300 little data points that talk to these different value cases. So it really helps governments, and we've seen this when working with governments, and it helps them understand what is the information that I actually need to be able to become more efficient or to provide information that is useful to providers so that they can understand where to put on a bid, right? So which are these data points? And we look at the full procurement process, and that's, I think, something that's very important to understand, because a lot of the systems that you're working on look at maybe just the procurement bid or just the contract award part, just the spending part. It really tries to integrate from the planning through to the implementation all of that information into one standard and one sort of sheet. So you really look at information, budgets, project plans, tender notices, specifications, values, timeframes, details, the signed contract, but also the spending in of itself. I have a couple of examples later on where we've looked at where each of those individual pieces are working, for example, within the US. But we've seen very little examples where this is working throughout the full cycle. So the idea is really to then say, okay, if I'm going to look at value for money, what I need is maybe the estimate price, and then how to see which are the how does this price develop over time? What is the price that in the end I pay? What are the other prices that other bidders come up with that participate in the process, and like what is the best value that I can get to there? So some of the examples and the potentials, like once you have this data, is to really think about like, what are the benchmark savings? How do you look at suppliers of performance, buyer performance, spotting problems in contracts earlier, identifying the demand and aggregate properly. And then especially on markets, really looking at spotting collusions. There's some really good examples coming out of some of the countries that we're working in where this has been very powerful. Greater use of SMEs and really better understanding like what are the kind of contracts SMEs are interested in bidding on? Where do we see SME participation go up, go drop? Which is like the level of contract value under which or beyond which SMEs sort of like do feel they can engage with you as a buyer. So these are really interesting examples that we're seeing. So some of these uses are explained here a little bit more across these stages, and this is where we also see some of the examples of how this data is being used across the world. So we see the kind of apps that you're familiar with coming out of Paraguay, analytics platforms that are using this information, and something that I'll be talking about a little bit later from the Czech Republic, where they actually say, like, from the buyer perspective, which of the government agencies I actually want to do business with because they are efficient and they will sort of pay me in time. This is working. We've been around for about 2.5 years. The standard of itself has been around for 3 years, and we're now working with or in about 30 countries. A lot of them are already actively publishing regularly their public procurement data to the Open Contracting Data Standard. And given that this has been around for a year, it's very interesting to see some of the really exciting results that we're seeing based on what is happening with this data. And I'll be talking about those now. So just a quick look at the US, where on the federal level, we haven't been really engaging too much with it. We've been looking a little bit at USA spending, options of outputting the API that is coming from BITA USA spending into the Open Contracting Data Standard. There's a huge issue in the US which looks at solicitation IDs across from sort of FedBizOps towards the spending data. And one of the solutions would be to just basically export both of these databases into the standard and reintegrate them sort of to really clarify what's happening with the money across time. On the municipal level, POGO, the organization, has done a review of like how much information is actually being published. And I found it quite surprising that, like, on the bad side, only 33 municipalities do regularly disclose proactively some of their contracts online. I found this, like, I think here we're talking to the trendsetters, and I'm excited about that, to sort of like see this. But there's still a lot of that don't. And I think, we have here Pennsylvania, we have Virginia, we have all of you guys here, which is exciting, And then some of the innovations that we're seeing, again, these are not related to the standard, but more sort of like on like how do you disclose that information for better use, is really planning data in New York City, where there's a law that says, like, if you're planning to publish a contract or like an RFP in 5 months, you have to publish that information. It's one of the good examples. Montgomery County really looks at basically has a really cool list of saying, like, these contracts are about to expire. So, like, if you're interested in it, here's the people you can talk to. That's the buyer. It has the name and the email address of the person who will renew that contract. It's a great opportunity to, like, sift through and look at the data. Award data. I think one of the interesting parts is like, how do you deal with direct awards? In Miami, they basically publish that information of saying, we will direct award because we don't know or we don't have any information about any other better buyers. But if you are, you have 2 weeks to sort of like raise that as sort of like you have a better solution. Contract data in Cincinnati, very detailed information. The full text of the contracts are online there. And in Austin, they go all the way to the implementation data, which is exciting. One of the examples where we're now talking about open contracting data standardized information comes from, and you can hold your breath a little bit because it's not a country that is famous for its sort of good governance. Talking a bit about the question earlier on. No, that's not the UK. It comes afterwards. Just quickly on the UK, where we're working with. Sorry, I was building up that, but I forgot that I wanted to quickly talk about the UK, where we're working with sort of the federal government on better understanding their goal on reaching SMEs. So the looking at both sort of like potential providers that give you more detailed analytics and sort of like what is the scale, sort of what I've been talking about before, no? Like where do SMEs start being interested in participating in bids and how can you either increase that or like facilitate that? So we're working there with the UK government on this. And that's been really useful to understand sort of like what are the policies around that you also need to implement to accompany the technology, the information. So this is the country that I actually wanted to get to, Ukraine. And given that they've been so corrupt, they've basically 3-4 years ago, they've decided to say, well, there's one big issue here, it's corruption. All of the business is being done basically by cronies of the current president. What we have to do to really disrupt this situation is to completely rehaul the procurement system. So they've built up their procurement system based on the open contracting data standard and then added different modules to it, like reverse auctions, like business intelligence modules. And at the same time, keeping that information for everyone to see at all times. So this is their public business intelligence platform that looks at a specific number of KPIs that they've defined before that they want to reach. So it looks at how many, sort of like the number of buyers per participation, the number of new buyers that start engaging with the government. And this is sort of a little bit the APIs, like on the tech side, it's been really interesting to make sure like they have a central database and that is then synced automatically to different marketplaces that cater to the different types of suppliers that are working with. So there's a marketplace that's focused on IT solutions. There's a marketplace focused on services. There's a marketplace that focuses on businesses with, different kinds of profiles. And that's been really successful in bringing down prices and also getting better estimates for prices. So what they've seen over the last 2 years is that they started with savings of about 15% just by simply introducing a better e-procurement system and reverse auctions. But over time, they've realized their savings have gone down to 10%. So you might say, well, savings have gone down. That's not so good. But actually, it's because they've gotten better at understanding what is the actual market value of what I'm purchasing. I think that's something, especially when you look at the savings sort of indicator that we're seeing is very complex, no? Because if you start with a high estimate price and the price is low, like you have huge savings, but it doesn't really say much. So we try to go away from the savings indicator when we look at what you can do with the data. So that's been really successful, but more interesting is the number of bids overall grew by 15%. The number of unique suppliers grew by 45%. Tenders sort of with like, some of the important parts is also like the kind of engagement that you have with your buyer community. And they've built a couple of tools around that as well that directly link to the award. It's like tenders with like 100% engagement and feedback really are much higher, have a much higher success rate of going through than the ones without. And then really interestingly, and that's I think that goes directly to their goals, is few of those who are participating in the process are saying like actually when previously it was about 50% of entrepreneurs that were saying there's corruption in the system, it doesn't make sense for me to participate. Now it's about 25%. And we've talked to a lot of buyers in like understanding a bit better their motivations, and they say, well, now I actually feel like I have a fair chance of participating. So, I mean, the corruption issue is not so much an issue here in the US, but it's really about understanding like, okay, what are the barriers for those companies of why they don't understand, and this data that will help you do that. And in the Ukraine, this has been really successful. Another sort of like interesting case from Paraguay, which I'm mentioning because it's an easy system because they basically manage all of the contracting and the procurement processes of the whole country. Not so much here. Actually, just a quick question. How many solution providers do we have here in the room? Like, raise their hands. Yeah, and I think that's a lot. And I feel like, well, it's not so many, actually not that many here in the room, but if you look at across the US, there is so many that each of them will bring out a new system or a different system. And looking at sort of interconnectedness is one of the key challenges that I see between the systems. And the Open Contracting Data Standard can help you that, and they've realized that in Paraguay as well, as like bringing this all together. But what they've seen is that they've integrated open contracting so that everyone understands where the process stands, and they've seen sort of the modifications of the contracts really go down. Like, people didn't have to go back and create amendments and sort of adjust after the fact, but really sort of like they got it right from the beginning, which I think is one of the key efficiency indicator as well. And I mentioned the Czech Republic because it is an organization has developed sort of a way of like giving agencies an understanding of like how well they are doing as a provider. And I think that could be really interesting to both like internally motivate and get agencies on board that might not be that interested in moving to an e-procurement system, but also gives you a good understanding of like where those issues are. So Zindex is the tool, and they've been as part of our innovation challenge that we've done over the last half year, they've been developing the Open Contracting Data Standard component to it. So just to briefly end on how to get started, and just like as a way of like saying that there's because it gives you a good sense of like how we work with governments. The Open Contracting Partnership runs a free help desk. The Open Contracting Data Standard is an open source tool. So there it is really for us more about making sure that this information is available so that we go from value for money to value for many for all of the participants through it. And we would love to help you in that process, sort of like really think about like, how do you want to use the data? What is your key focus? And I love the outcome from the panel before, and where we're looking at focus on one problem or two problems maximum, and think about like, what is the data that you need to really measure progress and change on that. Based on that needs, I think each of your procurement systems look at the data that you have and the data that sort of the standard suggests. As I mentioned, it's sort of a global standard that provides you with a first step, a schema really. So it's not about filling all those 320 forms, but thinking about like, what is the information that I have that I may need to evaluate quality, and then work on these pieces, and then build sort of the tool around it, or like a platform as a service or a visualization that then feeds into some of the other tools. There are being tools developed that can be used by other providers. Publish it as open data, talk about it, and use it to work with others, and then sort of improve on what you started to learn, and sort of like go back to the start again. And that was really what I wanted to share with you, really seeing that this idea of like going from this big mess of Lego piles into like a neatly designed visualization that then you may also use to build like a little house, a little Lego house or so. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
I guess I'll ask one here, just because I was thinking about it earlier. Specifically, how, from a local government, or just as we're thinking about over here, talking about technology, how do you think this fits into kind of the broader technology efforts that others may be thinking about in terms of, should they incorporate this into their kind of solutions? Have you seen anything like that where they might be implementing something or there's a solution in place, and how do they kind of merge this as part of that standard?
Right. So I think the idea here is really to detach it from the different platforms that you have and think about, like, what is the data that I need to understand and measure sort of my progress. And then that may then be reintroduced into the platforms that you're already using to visualize that information. But it gives you a way of like connecting different ecosystems that you're working with, the spend, the spending system, the solicitation system, the e-procurement system, sort of like really, and I mean, why not sort of like connect it to the blockchain as sort of like, here's the information that should be on there, sort of the minimum standard. And I think we've seen it as, when we worked with Mexico City, sort of, we've seen it as a good starting point to talk about this conversation of like, okay, but, civil society or suppliers, what is the information they're actually interested in? Like, what is the information they need? The standard gives you a starting point on doing that. So you can say, well, actually, if there's criticism or if there's interest, here is sort of like a first set of data that we can provide. And it also helps you understand if I want to sort of measure how efficient I am, or like how business might want to use my data, where are the gaps in information that I'm not providing? Because, there's a huge, there's an open data portal that people might not feel that useful in using. So I think these are just like one or two, three ideas of like how this integrates into the system. I think overall, the data standard is becoming a global norm. It's sort of recommended by the OECD as sort of like their way of publishing this information. And we're working with the EU as well on sort of like integrating this in the reform process. So it's really about sort of, here's a standard that helps you like guide yourself on like what information to publish.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.